When we talk about identifying women with what I'll call big holes, we're not talking about anything superficial or vulgar. We're talking about something much deeper, something psychological, emotional, and often invisible to the untrained eye. These holes are gaps in the self, voids created by unhealed wounds, unmet needs, or unresolved traumas. And perhaps the most dangerous of all is the emotional void, a hunger that wears many masks but always asks to be fed. Now here's the paradox: an emotional void doesn't always present itself loudly. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's silent, subtle. It's in the pause before a compliment. It's in the eyes that refuse to meet yours when vulnerability arises. It's in the moment she changes the subject when the conversation gets too real. And sometimes it's in the way she seems like she has it all together, until you realize that what you're dealing with isn't strength but survival. You see, there are women walking around with gaping emotional absences they themselves aren't fully aware of. Their childhoods were filled with conditional love, abandonment, or environments where their voice was never safe. So they learned to overcompensate. They became high, functioning, attractive, charismatic even, but behind that there's a quiet desperation, a kind of hunger for emotional safety, validation, or constant reassurance. And if you're not paying close attention, you'll mistake that hunger for affection. You'll confuse neediness with passion. You'll misread intensity as intimacy. And you'll tell yourself that your role is to love her enough to heal her. But love cannot fill an emotional black hole. No matter how deep your loyalty runs, no matter how patient you are, a person with a wide internal void will eventually ask for more than you can give. And here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. If someone has not addressed their emotional emptiness, they will drain you, not because they are evil or malicious, but because they're in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, you're not building, you're consuming. Let's get very specific. One of the clearest signs of this emotional vacuum is a relentless need for validation. I'm not talking about someone who likes compliments or occasional reassurance. I'm talking about someone whose sense of self is entirely dependent on how you see them, treat them, praise them. She may need to be constantly reminded that she's beautiful, that she's wanted, that she's different from other women. And if you don't deliver that validation on cue consistently, she starts to unravel. She starts creating emotional distance. She may withdraw. She may start testing you, becoming cold, sarcastic, or passive, aggressive, just to see how far you'll go to win her back. That's not love. That's insecurity masquerading as intimacy. Another form this void takes is emotional hypersensitivity. A woman with an unresolved emotional gap will often be easily offended or quick to perceive threat, even when none exists. You may say something innocent, something you thought was honest or helpful, and she'll take it as an attack. Why? Because she's not hearing your words. She's hearing her past. She's hearing her absent father, her critical mother, her dismissive ex. She's hearing everything you never said, but that her mind has rehearsed for years. You become a screen onto which her pain is projected. And unless she's done the inner work to separate you from that story, she will hold you responsible for wounds you didn't cause. Sometimes it even shows up as independence, that fierce, aggressive, I don't need anyone attitude, the kind that sounds like strength, but is often just emotional armor. Because if you look closely, behind that shield is fear, fear of depending on someone, fear of being abandoned again, fear of vulnerability, and so she performs strength instead of embodying it. She pushes you away to see if you'll chase her. She tests your loyalty by pretending she doesn't care. And you, thinking you've found a strong woman, may stay longer than you should, believing that if you just hold on, she'll soften. But you are not her healer, and she is not your project. The sad truth is, many men don't see these signs until they're in too deep, until they've invested time, energy, even love into a dynamic that is fundamentally imbalanced. They mistake emotional chaos for depth. They confuse unpredictability with passion. But the truth is, love should not feel like a constant test. It should not require you to prove over and over again that you're enough. That's not love. That's emotional dependency in disguise. And here's where it gets even more complex. These women don't always know they have emotional voids. They may be smart, accomplished, socially savvy. They may speak of healing, self-awareness, or empowerment, but knowledge isn't transformation. You can read all the books and quote all the podcasts, but if you haven't done the emotional excavation, if you haven't gone into the dark corners of your psyche and held yourself accountable for your own patterns, you're just dressing up the wound. You're painting over a hole in the wall and calling it a home. So, what should you do when you encounter this kind of woman? You don't shame her. You don't try to fix her. You recognize what's happening, and you ask yourself the harder question: do I want to be in a relationship that requires me to constantly pour into someone who cannot pour back? Can I love her without losing myself? Is this partnership or emotional rescue? It takes courage to walk away from someone who is deeply wounded, especially when you see their potential. But potential doesn't build relationships, practice does. Emotional wholeness does. Mutual self-awareness does. And until both people come to the table with at least some measure of that, love turns into labor, and labor without end leads to emotional burnout. So I'll leave you with this. If there's one thing we need to stop romanticizing in relationships, it's manipulation. Not the overt, obvious kind, not the textbook gaslighting or threats. I'm talking about the subtle, polished manipulation that walks into your life dressed like connection. The kind that looks like passion, charm, flirtation, even emotional intelligence, but is at its core a survival mechanism. And this is where we uncover the second sign of a woman who's operating with a big internal void, when she uses manipulation as her primary currency instead of authenticity, honesty, or mutual growth. Now, let's be clear. Manipulation doesn't always come from a malicious place. Often it comes from fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of not being loved unless she controls the outcome. It's a strategy learned early. Be in a home where love had to be earned, where vulnerability was punished, or where she had to compete for affection. So she adapted. She learned how to read emotional cues quickly, how to shift her behavior to get the reaction she needed, how to make people feel responsible for her emotions without ever saying it outright. And now, she brings those same tactics into her romantic relationship, soften without realizing it. She doesn't ask directly for what she wants. She implies, she hints, she expects you to guess. And when you don't, she punishes you emotionally, withdraws her affection, gives you the cold shoulder, or plays the victim. You're left confused, wondering what you did wrong, scrambling to fix a problem you never saw coming. That's not intimacy, that's control. Sometimes this manipulation shows up as seduction, not in the beautiful, healthy way that intimacy can be nurtured, but in the transactional way, where closeness is a tool, a bargaining chip. Affection becomes a weapon. Love becomes leverage. You find yourself walking on eggshells, hoping your actions are enough to keep her satisfied, to prevent the next emotional storm. You become more concerned with her moods than your own peace. That's when you know you're no longer in a relationship, you're in a performance, and the tragedy is, many men confuse this manipulation with depth. They say, she challenges me, she keeps me on my toes, she's mysterious, but challenge isn't the same as chaos. And mystery isn't the same as emotional unavailability. If every interaction feels like a psychological test, if you constantly feel like you're being measured and judged, you are not being loved. You are being assessed for your usefulness. And here's the part that stings. If a woman has a deep internal void, especially one she hasn't acknowledged or healed, she will view relationships not as partnerships, but as power dynamics. Subconsciously or consciously, she's asking, how can I stay one step ahead? How can I keep the upper hand? How can I ensure I don't lose? Because to her, losing in love feels like death. So she plays a game. She creates distance to make you chase her. She withholds affection to make you prove yourself. She praises you one day and criticizes you the next. Not because she's cruel, but because unpredictability keeps her in control. And what she fears most isn't your distance. It's her own vulnerability. You might think you're being strong by staying, that your love will somehow unlock her real self, that your consistency will eventually earn her trust, but you're not in a position to fix what she's not ready to face. You can't outlove someone's survival instinct, and the deeper the void, the more addictive this dynamic becomes, because it's not just her playing the game anymore. You start playing too. You begin to chase validation. You start measuring your worth by how happy you make her. You internalize the idea that love is something to be earned through endurance, patience, or sacrifice. But that's not love, that's codependency. And I want you to notice this. The women who manipulate instead of connect often have a pattern of short, intense relationships. There's always drama, always a story, a trail of toxic exes, and people who just didn't understand her. But what's missing is accountability. She's always the one who was wronged, always the misunderstood one. That's not coincidence. That's a narrative built to avoid reflection. And if she hasn't told herself the truth about her own behavior, she's not going to suddenly become self-aware just because you showed up with good intentions. Real connection doesn't require performance. It doesn't need manipulation. It flows naturally when two people are whole enough on their own to come together without power games. When a woman is healed, or at least healing, she doesn't need to play tricks to be seen. She shows up honestly. She communicates directly. She doesn't bait you into chasing her love. She invites you into a space where love is mutual, consistent, and unforced. So what do you do when you recognize this pattern? You don't become bitter, you don't retaliate, and you certainly don't try to play her game better than she does. You step back, you ask yourself, am I being valued or just being used? Is this real connection or emotional manipulation in disguise? And more importantly, what in me is allowing this to continue? Because sometimes we attract manipulation when we're not grounded in our own worth, when we're not solid in our boundaries, when we've been taught that love is supposed to be hard, that it's earned through pain. But healthy love doesn't confuse you. It doesn't test you constantly. It doesn't play with your peace like it's a toy to be picked up and dropped at will. So let me leave you with this. If there's one trait that reveals more than charm, beauty, or intelligence ever could, it's accountability. It's the quiet, unglamorous willingness to say, that was on me. And when it's missing, what you're often dealing with is not just immaturity or pride. You're looking at a deeper void, a psychological and emotional absence that can derail any relationship. No matter how much love, effort, or good intention you bring to the table. A woman who refuses to take accountability for her behavior isn't simply difficult, she's unstable in a very specific, dangerous way. She becomes a mirror that reflects only her pain and none of her patterns. Everything that goes wrong in her life is always someone else's fault. Her exes were all toxic. Her friends were jealous. Her bosses were controlling. Her parents didn't support her. And now you, yes you, become the next villain in a story she's been rewriting her entire life to avoid confronting the main character, herself. What makes this particularly dangerous is how convincingly this can be disguised. A lack of accountability doesn't always look aggressive. In fact, sometimes it looks wounded, vulnerable, innocent. She might cry when confronted. She might spiral into defensiveness or self-pity. She might even say all the right things, talk about trauma, past betrayal, or her need to be understood. But notice this. The moment you try to hold a mirror to her actions, the energy shifts. She shuts down. She flips the conversation. Suddenly, it's not about what she did. It's about how your tone triggered her, or how your delivery was too harsh, or how you should have known better than to bring it up at the wrong time. This is not sensitivity. It's deflection dressed up as fragility. And here's the truth no one wants to say. A woman who avoids responsibility for her actions is not emotionally safe, because in every relationship, conflict is inevitable. Mistakes will happen, boundaries will be tested, and when that time comes, if she lacks the inner capacity to own her behavior, you will find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, overcompensating for things you didn't break, and walking on eggshells to preserve peace she keeps disturbing. This isn't just about difficult conversations, it's about identity. People who lack accountability are often people who have not fully formed a stable sense of self. To admit fault feels like annihilation to them. Like if they're wrong, they're unworthy. If they hurt someone, they are unlovable. So they protect their image at all costs, even if it means rewriting reality, blaming others, or manipulating facts. This isn't always conscious, but it's consistent. And if you're not careful, you'll spend months, sometimes years, trying to get through to someone who's built an entire psychological defense system around never being wrong. Now, I want to be fair. Not every woman who struggles with accountability is malicious. Often, she's deeply wounded. Maybe she grew up in a home where mistakes were punished, not discussed. Maybe she learned early that admitting fault led to rejection, shame, or even violence. So she internalized this belief that to survive, she must always be right, always blameless, always the victim. And while that might explain the behavior, it doesn't excuse it, because love requires growth. And growth requires truth. You cannot build a future with someone who is addicted to being the innocent one. You can't plan a life with a person who sees every disagreement as a personal attack. You will exhaust yourself trying to protect their feelings from the consequences of their actions. And eventually, you will lose yourself trying to manage their emotional instability. One of the clearest red flags: she has a pattern of relationships that end badly, but she never admits her role. There's always a story, always a villain, always a justification. But rarely, if ever, is there a moment of self-reflection. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I sabotaged it. Maybe I still have healing to do. Those are phrases you almost never hear from someone who has a gaping hole where accountability should be. And without accountability, love turns into blame, intimacy becomes interrogation. You bring up an issue, and instead of being heard, you're put on trial, your words are twisted, your intentions questioned. You begin to dread conversations. You start avoiding honest dialogue, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin shrinking yourself to avoid conflict. That's not partnership, that's emotional erosion. This is where your standards must evolve, not just for how someone treats you in good times, but how they behave when they're wrong, how they handle discomfort, how they respond when you say, "That hurt me." A woman who can't hold space for that, who can't pause, listen, reflect, and take ownership, is not ready for anything real, because love, real love, is not a performance. It's a process, and it requires people who are willing to grow, not just be admired. So what do you do when you recognize this pattern in someone you care about? You resist the urge to fix them. You stop trying to teach someone who's committed to avoiding the lesson. You acknowledge that love cannot survive where accountability refuses to live. And most importantly, you ask yourself, why am I tolerating this? What part of me still believes that this is the best I can get? Because when you start holding yourself accountable for your own standards, your relationships change. You stop trying to rescue people from their own reflection. You stop explaining to grown adults why honesty matters. You stop watering gardens where the soil rejects growth. So let me leave you with this. Let's talk about emotional projection, a deeply misunderstood but incredibly common behavior, and another clear marker of what I call a woman with a big hole. Not in the superficial, demeaning sense, but in the psychological sense. A woman carrying an internal void, unresolved pain, or fragmented identity that quietly hijacks her relationships without her even realizing it. This kind of emotional hole doesn't just affect her, it distorts the entire emotional ecosystem of any connection she's in. And one of the most destructive ways it shows up is through projection. Now, projection is not about intention, it's about displacement. It happens when someone hasn't processed their own emotional pain or insecurities, so they unconsciously assign those feelings onto someone else. Think of it like a psychological reflex. Instead of looking inward and asking, where is this feeling really coming from? She casts it outward. She feels unworthy, so she assumes you're judging her. She feels guilty, so she accuses you of betrayal. She's afraid of abandonment, so she insists you're pulling away, even when you're present. And what makes projection especially hard to spot is that it often sounds like concern, or intuition or insight, but underneath that, it's fear speaking, fear wearing the mask of certainty. You might find yourself being accused of thoughts you've never had, motives you don't carry, or behaviors you haven't exhibited. And at first you'll be confused. You'll try to clarify, to explain, to comfort. But here's the trap. When you respond to projection with reassurance, it doesn't resolve anything. It feeds the cycle, because the projection isn't about you. It never was. It's about the war happening inside her, between the version of herself she wants to be and the version she can't quite face. And if she hasn't done the internal work to reconcile those parts, she'll keep casting shadows on the people closest to her. This is the woman who says, "I just know you're hiding something," even when you've been completely transparent. Or, "I can feel the energy shifting," when nothing has changed but her own internal anxiety. It's not intuition, it's anticipation. She's expecting betrayal because betrayal is what she knows. She's expecting distance because distance is what she's lived through. And when you show up with love, presence, and consistency, it doesn't always soothe her, it confuses her. Because the love you're offering contradicts the pain she hasn't healed from. And rather than receive it, she questions it, sabotages it, or reshapes it into something she can understand, even if that means turning you into the enemy. There's also a more subtle version of this. It's when she tells you who you are in a way that's really just a reflection of how she feels about herself. She says you don't communicate well, but really, she's the one who struggles to speak honestly. She says you're emotionally unavailable, but she's the one who shuts down when things get too vulnerable. She accuses you of pulling away, but she's the one keeping the relationship at arm's length. This kind of projection is quiet but corrosive, because over time it starts to erode your sense of reality. You begin to doubt your own intentions, you start questioning your own words, and eventually you start adjusting your behavior, not to be more loving, but to avoid triggering her insecurities. And that's when the relationship becomes less about love and more about emotional management. You're no longer building something together. You're tiptoeing around a landmine of unprocessed emotions, hoping to avoid the next blow up. That's not connection. That's caretaking. And while it may feel noble in the moment, it will eventually leave you emotionally depleted, psychologically confused, and deeply disconnected from your own needs. So what do you do when you recognize this dynamic? You don't attack, you don't defend, you pause, you ask yourself, is this really about me, or am I being pulled into someone else's unresolved story? Because here's what no one tells you. Some people are so wrapped in their past pain that they can't see you for who you are. They see you as a symbol, a stand-in, a representative of every person who ever failed them. And if you try to fight that narrative, you'll lose every time. Not because you're wrong, but because you're speaking truth to a version of reality they haven't yet questioned. And let's be honest, projection is seductive. It gives people a temporary sense of power. It allows them to avoid responsibility. It lets them feel safe, even if it's based on a false story. But safety built on illusion is fragile. It cracks the moment reality pushes back. And if she hasn't developed the courage to face her own emotional landscape, she will always need a scapegoat. And in a relationship, that scapegoat is almost always the person who loves her the most. The deeper issue here is that projection creates emotional distance. It places a wall between two people, even when they're standing inches apart. You can't touch someone who's convinced you're out to hurt them. You can't connect with someone who keeps mistaking your love for control. You can't reason with a mind that's using your every move to confirm a wound it refuses to confront. So your job is not to fix her. Your job is to stay rooted in your own clarity, to resist the urge to explain yourself endlessly, to see the difference between accountability and absorption, between empathizing and enabling, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone meet their own reflection. Without softening the blow, without carrying the blame, without offering yourself up as the emotional sponge for someone else's unhealed grief. And if she ever does the work, real, honest inner work, she'll look back and see the projections for what they were, echoes of pain, not truths about you. But that's her journey, not yours to script. So let me leave you with this. Let's talk about emotional entitlement. The fifth sign of a woman carrying a deep, unresolved void. And no, this isn't about high standards or knowing your worth. This is about a mentality that says, I deserve everything, even if I give nothing. A mindset where love is expected, but rarely reciprocated, where support is demanded, but seldom returned. It's the kind of inner lack that's masked as confidence. But if you look closer, it's entitlement born from pain. It's important to understand where this comes from. Entitlement doesn't show up in a vacuum. It's often rooted in deep emotional wounds, neglect, rejection, or prolonged environments where a woman had to fight to feel seen. Somewhere along the line, she decided that being passive wasn't safe anymore. So instead, she learned to take what she thought she needed, not with gratitude, not with balance, but with a belief that it's owed to her, without reflection, without accountability. Now, this can be confusing because on the surface, an entitled woman may appear self-assured. She talks about self-love, boundaries, what she won't tolerate, and those are good things, until they turn into ultimatums, until boundaries become justifications for selfishness, until self-love becomes an excuse for emotional withdrawal or refusal to compromise. Suddenly, you find yourself in a relationship where your needs are negotiable, but hers are gospel, where your feelings require justification, but hers require instant validation. She expects you to show up emotionally, financially, physically, but doesn't ask herself how she's showing up for you. And when you point this out, it's met with resistance or deflection, or worse, accusations. You're not supportive. You don't understand me. You're trying to control me. No, what you're doing is asking for reciprocity. And a woman operating from entitlement sees that as a threat, not a request. This kind of entitlement is one of the most subtle, toxic patterns in modern relationships, because it often wears the language of empowerment. It uses phrases like, "If he loves me, he'll do it," or "a real man would just know." These aren't standards, they're expectations with no foundation in mutual respect. And over time, they create imbalance. You feel like you're constantly performing, earning affection, proving loyalty, trying to avoid emotional backlash, but you never feel chosen, not for who you are, only for what you can give. Entitlement makes everything transactional. Love becomes a currency and you're always underpaid. You give effort, she wants more. You show up, she moves the bar, you open up, and somehow that becomes a weapon later. You're not in a partnership, you're in a loop of emotional debt. And the deeper you go, the more you lose sight of your own needs, your own peace, your own worth. And here's the real kicker. An entitled woman often believes she's the one being oppressed. She believes the world has wronged her, that men don't measure up, that love never works out because people always disappoint. And when that belief system is in place, she walks into relationships not with openness, but with expectation. She's not exploring who you are, she's measuring you against an unspoken checklist, and no matter how well you perform, the list will never be complete, because it's not about you, it's about the emptiness she's trying to outsource. Now, don't get this twisted. There is nothing wrong with a woman wanting to be treated well, with asking for support, with expecting consistency. But there's a difference between standards and entitlement. Standards come from self-awareness. Entitlement comes from unresolved pain. Standards say, "This is what I bring, and this is what I need." Entitlement says, "You owe me something, even if I bring nothing." And if you can't see the difference, you'll spend your life trying to please someone who doesn't know how to receive love, only how to demand it. This mindset doesn't just affect how she treats you, it affects how she sees herself. She believes she's strong because she doesn't settle, but real strength isn't about what you reject, it's about what you build. And you can't build connection when one person thinks they're always right, always deserving, always the center. Healthy relationships are not built on pedestal worship. They're built on mutual elevation. So how do you know when you're dealing with this kind of entitlement? Watch how she responds when she doesn't get her way. Does she shut down, lash out, punish you emotionally? Or does she reflect, adjust, and re-engage with maturity? Entitlement is most visible in how someone handles disappointment, if every no is taken as disrespect. If every boundary you set is seen as rejection, if your autonomy is treated like disloyalty, then you are not with someone who wants love. You're with someone who wants control disguised as love. And I need you to hear this. Being a man who gives, supports, and nurtures does not mean sacrificing your dignity. It doesn't mean signing up to be emotionally drained in the name of being there. Real love has room for both people to exist, for both to give, for both to be held. Anything less is not love, it's imbalance. So if you're finding yourself constantly questioned, constantly depleted, constantly adjusting while she remains rigid in her entitlement, ask yourself the hard question: is this love? Or is this performance? And if the answer is performance, stop performing, because at some point choosing someone who believes they are always owed more than they offer is a reflection of what you believe you deserve. And when you begin to choose balance over chaos, partnership over pedestal, peace over pressure, everything shifts. Let me leave you with this. There's a specific kind of emptiness that masquerades as excitement, a restless, insatiable energy that always wants more. More attention, more stimulation, more experiences. And while on the surface it might look like ambition or zest for life, it often reveals a much deeper void, a spiritual kind of hunger. This brings us to the sixth sign of a woman operating with what we've been calling a big hole, an inner emptiness masked by chronic discontent. You see, not all voids are loud. Some are dressed in motion, constant movement, constant change, constant dissatisfaction. She's never still, never grounded. There's always something missing, something just out of reach, and she believes that the next thing, a new relationship, a new trip, a new wardrobe, a new version of herself, will finally make her feel full. But it never does, because the chase isn't about growth, it's about distraction. It's about numbing the ache she doesn't want to sit with. This kind of woman may come across as exciting, dynamic, spontaneous. She draws people in with her energy. There's a fire in her, a kind of urgency to live that feels magnetic. But after a while you start to notice a pattern. She gets bored easily. She loses interest quickly. One week she's obsessed with you. The next she's distant. She's always chasing a high, not necessarily drugs or parties, though that can be part of it, but emotional highs, moments that allow her to escape the low she can't name. You begin to see that her enthusiasm isn't rooted in presence, it's rooted in escape. She's not excited about life, she's running from herself. And when you, as her partner, start to represent routine, stability, or emotional consistency, you become a mirror she can't stand. Not because you've changed, but because your calmness exposes her chaos. Your emotional availability highlights her restlessness. Suddenly, you feel like a placeholder in a script she's rewriting every week. And you begin to wonder, was she ever here at all? This pattern is more common than we'd like to admit. And in today's world, where stimulation is constant and attention spans are short, it's easier than ever for someone to mistake chaos for passion. But here's the truth. If someone needs constant novelty to feel alive, they're not living, they're surviving. And survival by nature is reactive. It's rooted in fear, in scarcity, in lack. You might notice that this woman romanticizes the beginning of everything. The honeymoon stage, the thrill of a new connection, the rush of being desired. But the moment things settle, she becomes distant, cold, or worse, she starts looking elsewhere for that spark. Not necessarily physical infidelity, but emotional unavailability dressed up as I just need space. Or I'm working on myself, but what she's really doing is fleeing the one thing that terrifies her, emotional stillness, because in that stillness the truth starts to rise, and for someone with a deep internal void, truth is unbearable. It asks too many questions. It forces them to feel the discomfort they've spent years running from. So instead, they keep moving, keep searching, keep reinventing, and if you stay close long enough, you'll start to feel like you're chasing someone who's constantly shaped. shifting. Because she is, and it's not because she's malicious. It's because she's not anchored. She doesn't know where home is emotionally, so everyone she meets becomes temporary shelter, including you. Now, let's be honest. This kind of woman is intoxicating at first. She makes you feel alive. She pulls you into her world like a storm. Passion, laughter, unpredictability. But storms don't last, and when the high fades, all you're left with is debris, confusion, doubt. You'll ask yourself, what did I do wrong? And the answer is nothing. You were just never meant to fill a void that existed long before you arrived. And I need to say this clearly. You are not responsible for someone else's sense of peace. If a woman doesn't know how to find wholeness within herself, she will keep searching for it in people, places, and moments that cannot provide it. And no matter how much love you offer, it will never be enough to quiet her restlessness. Because restlessness is not about what's missing on the outside. It's about what's unresolved on the inside. So, how do you recognize this early on? Pay attention to how she handles stillness, how she navigates boredom. Can she sit in silence without reaching for her phone? Can she enjoy your company without needing an audience, a plan, a thrill? Or is she always looking for the next thing to fill the space? And more importantly, ask yourself, do I feel seen or just entertained? Am I part of her growth or just part of her distraction? Because love, real love, requires presence. It requires depth, and depth only happens when someone is willing to stop running and face themselves. The hardest part, these women often leave you feeling like you're the one who wasn't enough. Like if only you were more exciting, more successful, more emotionally available, maybe then she would have stayed. But that's a lie, because the truth is, her leaving had nothing to do with you. It had everything to do with the fact that staying still forces her to feel the emptiness she's been trying to ignore, and no one can outrun themselves forever. So let me leave you with this.